Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Noel, and I'm the director of the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books and Manuscripts. And it's my great pleasure to open the conference, Jonathan Swift in the 21st Century. I like the title of the conference because the art of political satire that Swift so brilliantly practiced is today alive and well, and in these preposterous times, necessary. One tends to think of political satire as having a short shelf life. But even John Oliver, 300 years Swift's junior, cannot pull you up short to make manifest absurdity, vanity, and injustice, as Swift still can, and goodness knows, is not for want of great material. This is the inaugural annual J.I. Kislak program. And Mr. Kislak, who so generously provided the naming gift for the glorious pleasure dome in which you are now seated, wisely set aside some monies for the funding of signature events in the center. Working with the Kislak Advisory Committee, it was agreed that these events should be focused not on new acquisitions, nor indeed on general themes in bibliography, but rather on the historic collection strengths of the Kislak Center itself. And Swift is certainly one of those strengths. This is due to the acquisition of 3 collections. First, in the 1950s, the extraordinary Tearing collection, made possible by the efforts of Arthur H. Scouten, Penn Professor of English. Second, the books of Archibald C. Elias, Jr. And third, in 2009, the collection of Geoffrey Denison. The riches of Penn Swift holdings are currently on view in the Goldstein Gallery in the exhibition A Raging Wit, The Life and Legacy of Jonathan Swift. It is an extraordinary display of material and rich with information. I do hope you get the chance to see the show, even beyond the time set aside in the conference program. The exhibition was curated by the Kislak Center's senior curator, Lynne Farrington. Lynne's knowledge of the collections and her passion for sharing that knowledge shine through this wonderful, thoughtful show. Lynne has also masterminded the conference, which brings together scholars, collectors, and booksellers to celebrate and re-examine the works of one of the best-loved literary figures of the English-speaking world. It takes many people to put on a conference and many more to put on an exhibition, but the sine qua non of the events currently unfolding is Lynne Farrington, whom I now invite to the podium. Lynne.
Thanks, Will. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight in this lovely weather for the opening of the exhibition and conference celebrating the 350th anniversary of the birth of Jonathan Swift. This exhibition was originally planned to open last November in the Cayman Gallery on the first floor of the library, since, to the best of our knowledge, Swift was born on November 30th, 1667. However, it was not the perfect space for this exhibition, and when the Goldstein Gallery up here opened up in the exhibition calendar for the Winter-Spring 2018 show, I jumped at the opportunity to use it instead, remembering that until 1752, 7 years after Swift's death, the official start of the year in England and Ireland was March 25th, meant that I could legitimately claim the exhibition was opening and the conference was taking place in the year of Swift's birth. Sneaky, but useful. Of course, I did get one email from a Swift scholar pointing out to me my mistake, and when I responded with my reasoning, he wrote back to say, "Very shrewd of you to revert to ancient times for your conference." Over the past century, Penn has acquired a number of important collections of works by and relating to Swift. These include the Herman Tearing collection of early editions of his and related works, the Denison collection of illustrated editions of Gulliver's Travels through to the present day, the collections given by Swift scholar Archibald C. Elias, Jr. of contemporary responses to Swift's writing, works read by him and influencing his writings, and works by those in his circle, or rather, circles. These collections reveal the vital role of collectors in gathering together the materials that shape scholarship. Today, I would like to acknowledge the presence in the audience of Clement Scouten, whose father, Arthur Scouten, himself a scholar of Swift, was instrumental in Penn's acquisition of the Herman Tearing collection, and Margaret Elias Garrity and Clara Elias, whose father, the Swift scholar Archibald C. Elias Jr., gave Penn his collections of books and manuscripts relating to Swift and Ireland, as well as the 18th century oil painting of Swift in the exhibition gallery, and whose scholarship advanced our understanding of Swift's early years and of specific works in the Penn collection. The full title of one of Elias's collections, the Swift's Library and Reading Collection, is The Library and Reading of Jonathan Swift, a Partial Replication, a collection given to the University of Pennsylvania Rare Book and Manuscript Library in 2005 in memory of Susan Homans Elias, his wife, and Margaret and Clara's mother, and in honor of the late Heinz J. Wenken. It is wonderful to have the three of them here with us tonight. Before I go any further, I'd like to thank the following colleagues without whom this exhibition and conference would not have been possible. To H. Carton Rogers, the Vice Provost and Director of Libraries, for supporting Kislak exhibitions and programming, and specifically the acquisition of the Denison Collection. To Will Noel and David McKnight, Director of Rare Books and the Rare Book and Manuscript Library, and Betsy Bates, the Director of Operations in the Kislak Center, for supporting my work on this exhibition and the opening symposium that we're celebrating tonight. Erin Mitsukani and the Kislak Center, and Chris Lippa and Michael Overgaard in the Schoenberg Center for Electronic Text and Imaging for photographing the many books and objects seen in the exhibition, and there are many facsimiles from books in our collection, as you will see. For also doing the photography for the 2018 Swift calendar and for the interactive screen that you'll see outside the gallery. To Dennis Mullen, who created the presentation of images of Gulliver's Travels for the interactive screen. To Sarah Rydell, Sue Bing, Molly Reynolds, Valeria Kremser, Sibylla Benetova, and Logan Kirsch in conservation for matting and framing all the works in the exhibition. To John Pollock and Dan Traster for their red pens in editing the exhibition text. To Andrea Gottschalk, Emily White, and Linda Brody in exhibitions for printing and framing the many facsimiles, for creating the amazing 45-foot long map of the road from London to Holyhead, this facsimile. I think we're going to try to bring it out tomorrow and unroll the whole thing so you can see the whole thing. I think it would be fun to do that. And as always, for designing and installing an absolutely beautiful show. I can't thank them enough. And finally, to Alita Arthurs for overseeing the conference logistics, including lodgings for our speakers, victuals during the conference, and the lovely reception you'll be enjoying following James Woolley's remarks. I would also like to recognize my colleagues in Penn's English department, Tony Bowers, Michael Gamer, and Severe Call, who were instrumental in co-organizing and co-sponsoring this conference. Additional thanks go to Severe for securing funding from the School of Arts and Sciences and the University Research Foundation for the conference, and for organizing the group of graduate students who will respond to the talks. For all of them, thank you so much for everything you've done. Now to the exhibition. Knowing well the extent of our Swift's holdings here at Penn, I also knew that we had to do an exhibition for the 350th. My first thought was, of course, to ask James Woolley, now Emeritus Professor of English at Lafayette College, knowing that he had spent hundreds of hours here working in Penn's collections over the past decades. He regretfully declined as he was in the midst of editing Swift's poetry with Stephen Carrion, who will be speaking on Saturday. It was then I knew I had to do it myself. Although I was an English major in college, I was not a Swift scholar, and while I was familiar with many of his works from years of working with the collections, I could see that this was going to be a daunting task, precisely because I didn't want to do an exhibition that simply highlighted a few of Swift's works and ignored the rest. Rather, I wanted to explore Swift across time and space, and in doing so, expose the depth and breadth of the Penn collections. And I hope now I have done him justice. In the interest of time, and to give you a sense of the exhibition for those of you who have not yet visited the gallery, and I'm happy to give a short tour after the remarks, I will simply mention that while it appears to begin chronologically, focusing on Swift's early years and publications, it quickly becomes more thematic, exploring politics, Ireland, relationships and friendships, travel, publishing, and more. There is also an interactive screen that I already mentioned outside the gallery with 24 images from the editions of Gulliver's Travels. Finally, I should mention that an online version of the exhibition is planned and should go public a short time after the physical exhibition comes down in mid-May, if not before. Now to introduce James Woolley, who graciously agreed to speak to us this evening. In advance of the conference, James went through the exhibition with a fine-tooth comb, for which I thank him immensely, and discovered some small typos and minor points that will be corrected in the online exhibition. He also, more importantly, pointed out attribution issues that emerged in part from the research that he and Stephen Carrion have been doing. If only library catalogs could keep up with these changes. I would like, however, in my own defense, to view this as an indication of how scholarship in Swift is not complete, but ongoing, with new discoveries being made about the authorship of works attributed or not to him. Of course, this has much to do with Swift having published most of his writings anonymously during his lifetime. That is why the new Cambridge edition of the works of Jonathan Swift, about which Ian Gadd, one of the general editors, will speak on Saturday, is so important. So, in a nod to James, Stephen, Ian, and all the scholars who will be speaking to us over the next 2 days, I want to thank them for advancing scholarship on Jonathan Swift. At this time, I'd like to welcome James Woolley to speak on Collecting as Scholarship, the Swift Collections at Penn.
Thank you very much, Lynne. There are lots of reasons to come to Philadelphia, and some good reasons to observe Swift's 350th birthday. One of the best reasons to mark Swift's anniversary in Philadelphia at Penn is the Penn Libraries' outstanding Swift collections. Of course, Swift's 350th has already occasioned several conferences, which this conference joins in providing welcome outlets for Swift scholars. And not only that, but forensic anthropologists in Dublin marked the 350th by developing 3D color images of Swift and Esther Johnson's heads from the casts of their skulls. Ireland issued a 15-euro commemorative coin, which only costs 60 euros. And there were good Swift exhibitions at the Royal Irish Academy and Trinity College Dublin. But we have Lynne Farrington's splendidly conceived and executed exhibition right here, and based entirely on Penn's collections. And I'm encouraging you to take her advice and spend a lot of time in that exhibition. In fact, much of what I'm about to say could be considered a side note to this fine exhibition. To be sure, today is not the first time that scholars have gathered at Penn to celebrate an exhibition of the library's Swift collections. The first may have been on the 26th of January, 1957, heralded in a New York Times article, which I'm going to pass around, pointing out that Herman Tierink and Herman Tierink's Swift Library, recently acquired and to be exhibited at Penn, had narrowly escaped destruction in the Netherlands during World War II. And Lynne has placed in her exhibition Tierink's letter about his struggle to preserve his books during wartime. Jim Clifford's Johnsonian newsletter reported that at the 1957 opening, there was an admirable address by Ronald Crane, Swift and the Perfectionists, in which he analyzed the recent trends in critical interpretation of the Fourth Voyage of Gulliver. The Daily Pennsylvanian ignored Crane's talk, but did report that the exhibition was set up by Dr. Morris Johnson and Dr. Arthur H. Scouten, associate professors of English. I feel confident that Scouten in particular was instrumental not just in curating the exhibition, but in bringing the Tierink collection to Penn in the first place. As one who has benefited from the Tierink collection for a very long time, I want to speak not only about Tierink, but also about three other collectors whose Swift books are now here. They've been mentioned already: Jeffrey Dennison and his collection of Gulliver, and my friends Arch Alias, who died in 2008, and John Fisher, who died in 2015. They were my former colleagues in the Swift Poems Project, a project that has depended on the Tierink collection from the get-go and that regards Penn is in many ways its library headquarters. You can see some of the Denison, Fisher, and Alias books in the exhibition. John Fisher was the author of some enduringly important research papers. I'll mention just two of them. They are both in publishing history and the history of censorship. The legal response to Swift's The Public Spirit of the Whigs in 1981, and the government's response to an epistle to a lady in 1986. John's wife, Panthea Reed, gave a substantial part of John Swift collection to Penn, making that the most recent major addition to Penn Swift resources. The earliest major addition, by contrast, was those books of Herman Tyrink, who died in 1961 at the age of 81. He was a Dutch schoolmaster and scholar, and is known today for his bibliography of Swift's writings, first published in 1937 and cited over 1,000 times in WorldCat, over 1,000 times in the ESTC. His first publications in 1912 were editions of stories by Charles Dickens, George Eliot, and Joel Chandler Harris, adapted for Dutch children learning English. In 1925, at the age of 45, he published his University of Amsterdam dissertation, a critical edition of Arbuthnot's John Bull pamphlets of 1712, still worth reading. The main thing wrong with it is that it attributes those pamphlets to Swift. But two scholars who re-edited the John Bull pamphlets in 1976 look on the bright side, saying that the ingenuity and enthusiasm of Tyrink's mistaken argument for Swift's authorship did Arbuthnot studies a notable service by reawakening scholarly interest in the allegory. They repeatedly cite Tyrink's annotations. Tyrink's revised draft of his Swift bibliography was edited by Schouten and published by the Penn Press in 1963, and it's still essential. In the early 20th century, when Tyrink was compiling his bibliography, the extent of Swift's corpus was unclear, and knowledge of where copies of Swift's 18th century editions were to be found had to be laboriously acquired. Much that is now accessible in research libraries was then still in private collections. For a measure of what Tyrink accomplished in 1937, we need only compare his 434-page bibliography with Spencer Jackson's 130-page listing published in 1908. The Tyrink collection's extensive run of 18th century collected sets of Swift's works surpasses the holdings of any other library. What could you do with all these collected editions? I'll be offering some suggestions, but one thing for starters would be to inventory them, showing scholars exactly where each of Swift's works appears in each edition so that each work's transmission history could be more easily traced. Victor Rothschild's library, or Harold Williams's library, featured great Swift rarities. Tyrink's, by contrast, was a scholar's library, driving not toward major resale appeal, but toward coverage aiming at completeness. Although he didn't achieve completeness, and indeed it is still not achieved here or anywhere, and most probably never could be, the goal of listing and describing everything, if not actually owning it, has made his collecting and his bibliography foundational. I want to turn next to the books collected by Arch Alias. He was an independent scholar and one of the more important Swift scholars of this or any period. He amassed a large collection of books, some of which he gave to Penn during his lifetime. He bequeathed his remaining scholarly library, partly to Trinity College Dublin, and the rest to Penn, the Swift books to TCD, and everything else to Penn. He explained this division to me by saying that Trinity needed a better representation of books by its most famous alumnus. His loyalty to those two institutions was strongly influenced by his bond to the librarians Paul Pollard and Charles Benson, both at TCD, and Dan Traister here at Penn. Paul, Charles, and Dan aided and abetted Arch's research in myriad ways. Those who know Dan, who's here today, or who knew Paul and Charles will easily understand why Arch was devoted to them and why he acknowledges them so prominently in his edition of Pilkington's memoirs. In his collecting, Arch was investing in the possibility of significant scholarly publication. A striking case in point is the manuscript glossary of hard words in Esther Johnson's handwriting with corrections in Swift's handwriting, now at TCD, and just published under the title Jonathan Swift's Word Book. Arch was a protege of the scholar-collector James Osborne, and in the Osborne collection at Yale, you can see correspondence between Osborne and Arch in the 70s when Arch was deciding whether to bid a very significant sum for the Word Book, which was to be auctioned at Sotheby. Osborne encouraged him to get it because, he said, it would surely lead to a significant publication. Like Osborne, Arch considered the Word Book evidence. He was an exponent of what we would call evidence-based research and what he called documentary scholarship. Frank Ellis, reviewing Arch's book, Swift at Moore Park, Problems in Biography and Criticism, wrote, "Alias is impatient with guesswork." Arch's documentary scholarship is amply demonstrated in his masterpiece, his 2-volume edition of the Memoirs of Letitia Pilkington. The Pilkington Project substantially accounts for the depth of Dublin imprints and Irish history, especially local history and family history, among his more than 2,000 books now at Penn. These books include over 600 pre-1800 Dublin imprints. One of these Dublin pieces that particularly interests me is Patrick Delaney's poem, An Epistle to His Excellency John Lord Carteret, which, when it came out in 1729, was resented, the resentment in turn provoking Swift's poem, A Libel on Dr. Delaney. The alias copy of the Delaney poem is the rare deluxe folio printing, as good an example of fine printing as Dublin printers could produce. We know that presentation copies of poems were usually covered in marble paper, as this copy is. And Lynne has put this in her pop-up exhibition so that you can see it for yourself. Arch's interest in Swift's so-called triumph-feminate of writers, Mary Barber, Elizabeth Sykin, and Constantia Grierson, led him to acquire the manuscript of Grierson's poems that you can see in the exhibition. It also led him to identify a Dublin writing group called the Senatus Consultum that included these writers, as well as Letitia and Matthew Pilkington, Mary Barber, Patrick Delaney, and Swift. Arch suggested that the Senatus may, on occasion, have polished some of Swift's own work into a bland vanilla correctness. Arch's books reflect his interest in Irish studies generally. He encouraged new Irish studies scholarship by endowing the ASECS, Irish American Research Travel Fellowship. The application says that this fellowship is restricted to documentary scholars whose research centers on primary sources from the 18th century, printed matter, manuscripts, buildings, works of art, or other artifacts, rather than on the secondary literature already extant. Another of Arch's collecting interests was copies of books Swift owned, preferably in the exact edition he owned. Arch managed to get about half of Swift's roughly 650 titles. One of his most brilliant pieces of scholarship was to identify 15 pamphlets that had been in Swift's library. This he did by finding and identifying as Swift's the pamphlet volume's table of contents in Swift's handwriting after a dealer, not realizing that the volume had been Swift's, dismantled it to sell the pamphlet separately, retaining only the table of contents. Only 3 of the dispersed pamphlets have so far been recovered. The others are still out there and may someday be identified as Swift's copies. I proposed this manuscript of table of contents for the pop-up exhibition, and you can read Arch's fascinating story of his discovery in Philological Quarterly, Volume 75. Of course, identifying the books and pamphlets that Swift owned is only a start. Assuming he actually read these books, and of course, we don't necessarily read all the books we own, we will have to read his books in order to gain a clearer idea of how Swift's reading affected his writing. Finally, let me tell you something about the Jeffrey Dennison Gulliver's Travels collection, over 1,100 items. They're mostly, as Lynne said, 19th and 20th century illustrated editions of Gulliver's Travels, about 2/3 of them in English. This is the part of Penn's Swift resources that is ripest for research. Many of the books are for children and should be studied as children's literature. The collection provides abundant evidence for the history of book illustration. As Swift scholars, we would like to know precisely what scenes are chosen for illustration and what implied interpretation of the scene is offered by the illustrator. Online color scans of these illustrations, indexed by chapter and illustrator, would be widely used, I predict. The illustrations shown in the monitor just outside the door to the exhibition should whet your appetite. Many of these books are abridged and commonly also bowdlerized. What gets left out and what gets preserved in these abridgments? What conventions of book illustration are honored and what conventions are violated? What seemingly visualizable passages are never illustrated? The variety of genres and media in the Dennison collection is wide. Coloring books, sound recordings, pop-up books, comic books, cigarette cards, Viewmaster discs, paper dolls, playing cards, musical scores, and a jigsaw puzzle are all there. The collection also shows a broad range of typography and binding styles, particularly in small, cheap editions that were not meant for preservation in any library. As evidence for the popular culture reception of Gulliver's Travels, I don't know of anything like it. The British dealer Christopher Edwards, who sold the collection to Penn, describes Dennison as a London architect who was also a book collector of rare discrimination and tenacity. I asked Christopher whether he thought Dennison collected anything other than illustrated editions of Gulliver. He thought not. What he actually said was, the house was full of the collection, and there was little room for other books, let alone other objects, except bookcases, of course, but even those were overflowing, and there were books under beds and on windowsills. I can't say that Dennison's collecting was scholarship, but the Dennison collection has great potential as scholarly and cultural evidence. We often tell students that to do research, they must frame a research question and then find sources that will enable them to answer it. In practice, though, you very often start with the evidence and gradually devise the question. You find out something, or maybe several things, and ask yourself, what could this evidence be good for? That question needs to be asked and answered hundreds of times about the Swift resources at Penn. I've already offered a few suggestions, and here are just a few more. First, the prose writings of Patrick Delaney. How did his political and religious views evolve? Second, the typography of Swift's London printer, John Barber. Can his unsigned printing be identified? Third, the character of multi-volume complete works in the 18th century. What was considered suitable for inclusion? What was considered to warrant annotation? What is the evidence that these sets were actually read rather than used as furniture? Fourth, book prices. The relationship of paper stock, format, typography, press run, readership, and retail price, drawing on the physical books and also on advertised prices where available. Finally, copy-to-copy variation. The comparison of multiple copies of Swift's publications, setting the Tearing copies beside the digital surrogates in Echo, Google Books, HathiTrust, and the like. What variant readings and concealed editions can be detected? There's an increasing danger that we're relying too heavily on the Echo copies alone, which in most cases means the British Library copies. Axiomatically, among 18th century books, there's no such thing as a duplicate. Printers sold some copies before they had finished proof correcting. The presses could be stopped for authorial alterations, which would then appear only in some copies. Leaves could be canceled and replaced, perhaps only in some copies. Pen corrections could be made or errata slips added, only in some copies. If two copies of the supposedly same book are in fact not identical, what accounts for their differences? These are just a few more of the many possible avenues for research that would exploit Penn Swift resources. Although I've been talking mostly about three collectors, Terink, Alias, and Denison, it's crucial to point out that their books are here, usable, conserved, and cataloged, thanks to the ambition and vision of those who, back in the 1950s, decided to make this library a center for Swift studies. We owe thanks also to those who later donated books to strengthen the collection. I'm referring especially to Arch Alias, and thanks further to the Kislak Endowment and the Kislak Center's outstanding staff. I mentioned Spencer Jackson, Terink's forerunner in Swift bibliography, and in closing, I want to agree with one comment Jackson made back in 1908. He said, "The pitfalls for the unwary in Swift bibliography are innumerable." They still are. Pitfalls are being uncovered every day. The difference between 1908 and 2018 is that Swiftians in the 21st century are less unwary because of the work of Terink, Schouten, Alias, Fisher, and so many other collectors, bibliographers, booksellers, librarians, and editors. Thank you very much for listening.